get to 3, I want you to say ceasefire now. 1, 2, 3. Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! I want to ask you one final thing, to join me in a chant. Free, free Palestine!
Free, free Palestine!
Free, free, free Palestine!
Free, free, free Palestine!
Free, free Palestine!
Free, free, free Palestine!
Free, free, free Palestine!
Well, we're honored to have with us today Mrs. Melanie Phillips. She's an esteemed British journalist, currently with the Times of London. She's a broadcaster and author of several books on defending the West, including The Builder's Stone, How Jews and Christians Built the West, and Why Only They Can Save It, and Londonistan, written in 2006. Melanie, welcome to the Viktor Frankl Podcast.
Hello, very nice to see you today.
It's so timely you wrote a book called Londonistan. We might now be looking at a New Yorkistan. Last week, we witnessed a political earthquake here in New York. A fellow named Zoran Mamdani, a democratic socialist, won the primaries for mayor of NYC. He refuses to condemn the term globalize the Intifada. He was co-founder of Students for Justice for Palestine in college, and he ran on the DSA platform, which accuses Israel of apartheid, colonialism, and military occupation, and supports BDS and calls for an end to American aid to Israel. He wants to defund the police, give out free food, and tax white people. Melanie, unfortunately, you saw this happen in England. When you published Londonistan in 2006, many dismissed your warnings as alarmist. How do you see those reactions now, nearly 2 decades later?
Well, they are sadder and wiser people, the people who were saying that I was extremist and Islamophobic and all the rest of it. Because, I wasn't predicting anything. I never predict. I was merely looking at the situation and analyzing it as I saw it, and describing how it was unfolding. And it seemed to me quite obvious that unless it was corrected, it would lead to it would just escalate as a problem. The people who wanted to Islamize the West, to conquer the West for Islam, were at that stage in 2006 already well embedded, certainly in London. London was a kind of epicenter for this. It was, in fact, the place where Al-Qaeda was founded. And that's because Britain is, in terms of the countries of the world, has always been uniquely welcoming to dissidents. They believe that today's dissident is tomorrow's prime minister, and sometimes even today's terrorist is tomorrow's prime minister. So they've always had a very liberal outlook in that regard. And it's coming back to bite them. And I'm afraid to say that even now, with Britain really well advanced down this route, in all kinds of very frightening ways, the establishment still refuses to grapple with it and even refuses to acknowledge it properly. So I'm looking at what's happening in America, in New York, and especially, as you say, with this Mamdani individual, with great concern, but not a great deal of surprise, because I saw the seeds in America a long time ago. America, similarly to Britain, ignored CARE, the Council for American Islamic Relations, and they are very well embedded across the American scene. And I believe their supporters are embedded within successive administrations. And this was never acknowledged or thought about. Whenever I went to America, and I've been many times to give speaking engagements, people always said rather pityingly, how are things in Europe? It looks really bad. And I would say to them, well, it is bad, but you're not far behind. But Americans seem to believe they were invulnerable against all this. And I'm afraid they are now having a bit of a wake-up call.
Yes. Let me play for you a video that just came out of a fellow in Glastonbury. He was a fellow named Bob Villan, and he said these things. He sang the song against Israel in the West. Let's just listen to it.
Free, free! Free, free! All right, but have you heard this one, though? Death to the IDF! Death to the IDF! Death to the IDF! Yeah, from the river to the sea, Palestine must be, will be, inshallah.
You get your reaction to that video and the cultural scene in England.
Well, it's horrific. It reminds many of us of the Nuremberg rallies. This sea of Palestine flags, so-called Palestine flags, which to us resembles a sea of swastikas. The flag of Palestine has that kind of symbolic resonance, the same resonance as the swastika did, that it means the death to Jews. Many people carrying that flag don't realize that's what it means. They think that they're carrying a flag that supports the oppressed of the world in Gaza. But in fact, what it means is the extinction of Israel and the annihilation of Jews. And the horrific thing about that rally was that, bad enough, this dreadful rapper was saying all this terrible stuff. But what was really so completely chilling was that an estimated 30,000 revelers who had come along to Glastonbury to enjoy the music, they all chanted along with him, death to the IDF. And, you know, you could say they don't really know what they mean, but that's not really the point. You have, you know, thousands and thousands of young people who are calling for the murder, what amounts to every young Israeli, because the IDF is a conscript army. Virtually everybody, you know, has to do military service. And so what they were actually yelling for, chanting for, was the murder of every young Israeli. And they were also chanting, in effect, for the annihilation of Israel. You know, the IDF isn't just an army. It represents the Jewish state. And it's, although it is composed of a number of different ethnicities and religions, it has Muslim and Arab soldiers fighting for Israel. It has Druze and others, all of whom proudly and very conscientiously and patriotically fight for Israel. But nevertheless, the majority are Jews. It is an army of the Jewish state. And consequently, this chanting was perceived correctly by many people in Britain as a desire to annihilate the Jewish state. But what was interesting is that, you know, Britain, people are either indifferent or have signed up to the whole big lie that Israel is the rogue state in the region, that it is the aggressor, that it is the human rights it is the human rights abuser. It commits war crimes, far from being from trying to defend itself against genocidal annihilation, which indeed it is, fighting a war to defend itself. It's presented as the aggressor and as the killer of babies and so on. And I can't exaggerate to you the effect of all this and the scale of it in Britain. Because it has kind of become a default narrative amongst really not just, you know, the far left, the kind of people who would, or the young people who would go to something like Glastonbury, the sort of hippie-ish type of people. It's now the default narrative, I would say, among really the entire professional and certainly academic and political establishment. Now, this is a terrible thing that British Jews are living with, and it's accelerating and deepening and worsening virtually by the day. What was interesting about the Glastonbury spectacle was that almost as one, Britain rose up and said, this is abhorrent because this has crossed the line. You cannot have the public call for the murder of anybody. And so finally, there was a red line in Britain that was crossed. So, I mean, I'm a little bit cynical, to be frank. I mean, it was nice to hear that people, you know, responded to this at least and said this was a line that's been crossed. But, I mean, the reason it was crossed is because of the culture that has been pumping out incendiary lies and incitement to hate Israel, which is presented as evil. And consequently, all Jews who support Israel, and it's assumed that most Jews support Israel in Britain, They're also handmaidens to evil, and so they are targets for attack. And this is what has produced a kind of atmosphere which has legitimized the kind of thing that we saw at Glastonbury, even though, as I say, there was a reaction against it. But nevertheless, the culture has indeed legitimized it.
Yeah, and those people at the concert were not necessarily Islamists. They were people just going to the concert.
On the
But
contrary, they were mainly white, middle-class, well-heeled young people.
So, Melanie, help us understand this from your perspective. How do Islamic fundamentalists team up with the radical left to destroy the West? I mean, we see here in America, we see Mamdani supported by Tlaib, AOC, Ilhan Omar. They're working together. How did this happen, and how do we stop it?
It is surreal, isn't it? Because they're marching shoulder to shoulder. You have, white-skinned left-wing radicals marching shoulder to shoulder with Islamists who would take the head off their shoulders in different circumstances because they stand for and practice in their lives values which Islamists find inimical. So it is bizarre, except that it's not really bizarre because it's quite obvious. The most obvious thing is that both are marching shoulder to shoulder because both have a common aim. The common aim is the overturning of the Western order, the destruction of Western civilization, Western culture, and its replacement by something else. Now, both of them, the Islamists on the one hand, the white radicals on the other, they have a very, very different idea of what the society is that they want to put in place. The white radicals want the kind of John Lennon type utopia of the brotherhood of man, no war, nothing to fight or die for, no divisions, no nations to divide us, no religions to divide us. We're all basically one happy global family. And we can do our own thing, and we can be gay, and we can be straight, and we can be queer, and we can be transgender, and we can be living with many partners, and so on and so forth. And that's the kind of society they think they want to bring about. The Islamists, of course, want to produce the rule of Islam on earth. They want to Islamize every society that's not Islamic, which means that every society, in their view, would have to live under Sharia law, which requires submission to a set of rules which basically have absolutely nothing whatsoever in common with the West. They deny human rights. It is a savage, cruel and barbaric system. So you couldn't imagine a greater contrast between these two distant scenarios. However, they're both marching with the same purpose, to overturn the West, and they're both using each other. That's the first obvious similarity which binds them together. But then there's another similarity, I'm afraid to say, which is that the Islamists are fueled by murderous, indeed genocidal hatred of the Jewish people and the desire to annihilate the state of Israel. And the white liberals are motivated by the same kind of animus.
Well, you saw the same coalition that just put Mamdani at the head of the ticket. In New York City, the people that voted for Mamdani primarily were white, highly educated liberals from very wealthy neighborhoods. How do you understand that now?
Well, it's the same thing. They don't realize that what Mamdani. I mean, I think Mamdani is a slightly, I've looked at him obviously from afar, but with considerable interest. He reminds me of Obama because he has the same kind of appeal.
Charisma.
He is absolutely. Charisma. He is charismatic. He is young. He is handsome. He speaks very, very well. He's so articulate, and he's very persuasive, and he's charming. Charismatic, absolutely. And he very carefully ran on a platform designed to appeal to New Yorkers who are fed up with everything. They're fed up with the cost of living, basically. They're fed up with being priced out of housing. They're fed up with crime. Now, it's very interesting because, in fact, Mamdani, as you know better than I, has in the past called for the defunding of the police. I think he was quite quiet about that. on this when he was campaigning. But nevertheless, he positioned himself as somebody who was going to kind of bring order out of New York chaos. And he came up with a whole menu of ludicrous promises which can't possibly be kept, but they sounded attractive. And it sounded, I'm sure, of what I've been reading about the reaction, it sounded like, like he was speaking to us, he was speaking our language. And frankly, looking at who he was up against, I mean, this was the terrible thing. Andrew Cuomo, a failed politician. I mean, you just look at him, an absolute sleazebag with a terrible reputation. He's a failure. Why on earth would anyone vote for him? So what on earth was the Democratic Party thinking of? Answer, they saw nothing wrong with Mamdani. For them, he was an ideal candidate, charismatic, speaks the right kind of language, likely to appeal to like a Pied Piper to young people. What's not to like? Because the real problem, it seems to me, is the Democratic Party, which has become totally corrupted. I mean, morally and politically and intellectually corrupted over many, many years. It has totally lost the civilizational plot. And that's why, they were perfectly happy with Mamdani. And I'm sure they are concerned by the kind of blowback that appears to have been happening since then. But nevertheless, the problem is not Mamdani. Mamdani is the outcome of the problem. The problem is the Democratic Party, and looking again back to Britain, the problem is that the whole progressive wing of politics in Britain and America, represented in America by the Democratic Party, in Britain by the Labour Party, has gone to the bad. It's lost the moral and political and intellectual plot. It has signed up to a set of ideologies which are, first of all, inimical to the flourishing of Western society. They're based on the idea that the West is founded in the original sins of colonialism and racism and exploitation and all that, and it has to be overturned. And that's led them down various rabbit holes. They adhere to the idea that there is no such thing as objective truth, that everything is a matter of opinion, that everybody can make up their own reality the whole time, and all that. And they are against the nation. They think that the nation is the source of prejudice and division and war, and it has to be replaced by universal principles, the brotherhood of man. Now, Britain is the British left is I think I would say a global leader in this for various reasons, of which I think the most important is that Britain is a particularly godless society. Unlike America, Britain is really a post-religious society, and it's a society in which the established church, the Church of England, the Anglican Church, has, unlike the churches in America, the kind of red state bedrock churches in America, it is which have tried to hold the line against liberal universalism. In Britain, the Church of England was just led the charge. It had basically lost all its faith and become a kind of social justice church a long time ago. So you have this situation in which Britain was the kind of world leader, the leader in the West of the kind of post-Western ideological consensus. But you have that in America as well. Takes a different form. It's not quite so far along the line. You are much more divided in America. You have a great fight back, as witnessed by the fact you've elected Donald Trump twice. Whether or not you like Donald Trump is irrelevant. The fact is that he's been brought to power twice by people who don't want to lose America as the nation that it is historically felt and understood to be. So you have this problem that the whole progressive wing of politics has lost the moral plot, lost the political plot, has abandoned, I would say, conscience, justice, right and wrong, and rationality. You cannot bring facts to bear with these people. They won't have it. They say that, we don't accept your facts. There are no objective facts. Everything is a matter of opinion. We don't like your opinion because you are a partisan or whatever. So that's what's happened to the West. And so the Democratic Party has absolutely gone down that rabbit hole, and Mr. Mamdani is the outcome.
Right. And in your new book, The Builder's Stone, you advocate that we have to strengthen Western civilization. Could you please define for us, what do you mean by that? What is Western civilization?
Well, what I actually mean by that is civilization. It's civilized values that we all, whether we are religious or not religious, we in the West understand them to be civilized values. What do I mean by civilized values? Well, they're fairly fundamental. Respect for human life, political freedom, democracy, the rule of law grounded in the consent of the people, which is what democracy is. Compassion and conscience and putting others first, so you build community so that you don't have a war of all against all. You have a cooperative society. And these are not, I'm sure we can think of other basic values.
Perhaps personal responsibility, women's rights, and so on. Yeah.
Personal responsibility. I think that over many decades, I have charted the ways in which the intellectual elites and political elites in Britain having decided that the West in general and the Western nation state in particular are grounded in bad stuff and have to be replaced. I watched them take a wrecking ball to the institutions that keep the cultural show on the road, institutions such as the education system. The idea that the education system transmits the culture down to the next generation, which is what education is, because you want the culture to continue. Well, if you don't want the culture to continue, then you can't have that for education. So I watched and charted over many decades education being transformed into a vehicle for propaganda, for remaking the world in ways in which children were taught that's how the world should be. So that was education, family, the traditional family, the married family, went down the tubes on the basis that it was cruel and wicked to women and to people who lived irregular lives. I have nothing against people who live irregular lives. I think people should be free to live exactly as they want. However, for a society to abandon the core rules of a society that keeps the society's show on the road, which is the married family, which is the best system. Okay, it's not perfect. It breaks down sometimes and it produces casualties, of course. Nevertheless, it's the best system yet devised for producing autonomously motivated. I mean, people who are able to function as autonomous individuals, psychologically healthy individuals in the next generation. And it was destroyed. So I watched all those things happen. And it seemed to me, having watched, education, family, the idea of the nation go down the tubes, replaced by lifestyle choice, everyone makes up their own reality, no such thing as truth. The Western nation has to be replaced by universal values. And it seemed to me that it was obviously taking pot shot at the core values of that society. Now, the core values come from, Christianity is the foundational creed of the West, but Christianity didn't come from nowhere. It is actually an offshoot of Judaism. Judaism is its parent. And the kind of values that I'm talking about actually were created by Jews, by Judaism, by the Jewish people. Now, I would say these values are civilized values. These values aren't just values that made the West. Western civilization is a specific thing to do with the West. But I'm talking about values that I would consider civilized. Any society should be living by these values. And those values, which I would call civilized, were basically brought to the world by the Jewish people, by Judaism, and then, as it were, implanted into the West through Christianity. So uh, that's what I mean by Western civilization. I mean actually civilization, civilized values itself. And as the West goes down, civilized values are going with it.
Freedom, women's rights, the ability to have children protected by the school system, not to be propagandized against, and so on. We're definitely seeing that in America. And I've seen that in the realm of psychology. As you know, I'm an author on the book about Viktor Frankl, and I've seen psychology turn dramatically to the left. It talks all about the self, self-fulfillment, self-esteem.
Yeah. Indeed. It's all about the self. It's all about hyper-individualism on the basis that that's what makes us happy and fulfilled. Okay. Well, it doesn't actually, because one only has to look at the record amounts of deep psychological distress being exhibited, particularly by young people, but also by many others. Rates of depression and eating disorders and acting out of distress, drug abuse,
suicidal ideation, suicide.
Absolutely. And I would say also, promiscuity, the desperate attempt to find a relationship, as it's called, that produces love. And people don't understand anymore what a relationship actually amounts to and what it involves to keep it going. And they certainly don't understand what love is. It's all to do with the self. Now, I've said in the book, and I quote Viktor Frankl in the book, in my book, because it seems to me, and I don't wish to denigrate for a moment the sort of, the clinical pathology of some of these ailments, but it seems to me, looking at all what's going on, that first of all, you've got all this psychological distress, and then you've got a tremendous amount of young people desperately trying to find a purpose, an ideal. So
a meaning in their lives.
It's climate change. This is something about which they can do absolutely nothing. What they could do something about is looking after each other, looking after the people closest to them. But no. They throw those people aside, and instead they concentrate on climate change. Okay. Now, there are other examples one could bring to bear, but it seems to me, looking at it in the round, you have young people in particular desperately searching for a meaning to their life. It is the great cry for meaning. They are attaching meaning to all sorts of stuff which never gives them meaning and purpose, because it's all based on the individual. And if you base it on the individual, if you base it on yourself, it's never enough. You can never get to where you think you should be getting to, because where you think you should be getting to is a kind of fantasy. So what creates real meaning and purpose in life is things like challenge and difficulties. I'm not for a moment suggesting that it's nice to have difficulties and that people should suffer. But nevertheless, without challenge, without pitting yourself against something, you don't have meaning in your life. Without having to overcome obstacles, you don't have meaning in your life. If everything's given to you on a plate and all obstacles are taken away, all difficulties, all barriers, all codes that tell you must not do X and Y, well, then where does it end? You'll go on and on trying to find something which gives you some sort of purpose, because you don't get it from that. And so it seems to me that what we're living through is the great cry for meaning. And it's coming out in all sorts of strange ways. Western secular society got rid of God on the basis that religion was the great impediment to happiness and fulfillment. Okay. What did they do instead? They thought that they were, going to be free and happy. Okay, we just discussed how that wasn't actually working out so well. But they thought also that, people who are religious are really stupid. They're really dumb. They're really backward. And anyone who's intelligent knows that that religion is bunk. It's all superstitious mumbo jumbo. And we, the sort of liberal progressive, know that, what should govern us is reason, rationality. That's our highest calling. Okay. And what do we see as one of the fastest growing movements, certainly in Britain, and I think possibly in America, witchcraft. I mean, who do they think they're kidding? I mean, witchcraft? We have the rise, certainly in Britain, of paganism. We have the rise in things like astrology. I mean, people are not, they haven't gone from belief in God to an age of reason. They've gone from believing in something to believing in anything. And this is not rational. If they're going to believe what they believe, if religion is to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast, well, isn't it better to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast that actually lead to a better society and better outcomes for you as a person, rather than 6 impossible things for breakfast, which are barking mad and just basically are not going to give you any kind of fulfillment or satisfaction whatsoever? I mean, it seems to be a no-brainer.
Well, 100%. And I really see the breakdown in psychology. That debate started between Freud and Frankl about 100 years ago. Freud advocated total focus on the self. He said man was just made as an id. There's no soul in a system of psychology. Frankl advocated for finding meaning in psychotherapy, and few psychotherapists actually know much about this at all. Let me play with you a video about Viktor Frankl speaking, a very rare interview where he talks about his book he wrote in the 70s called, it was called The Unconscious God. Listen to what he says and listen to the interest of the interviewer about the strange title of his video. Here it is.
And I note that your latest book in English has an intriguing title, The Unconscious God. And it occurs to me that this is an unusual title for a psychiatrist to give to one of his books. I wonder if you'd comment a bit on that book.
It's a deplorable state of affairs that such a title should be unusual or challenging a psychiatrist, because it depicts the actual situation, and this is that for too long a time psychiatry has closed its eyes toward a phenomenon such as religion. Because religion is also a human phenomenon, and any human phenomenon should have been taken into account and taken at face value by psychiatry. Instead, for too long a time, as I said before, psychiatry, more specifically psychoanalysis, even more specifically Freudian psychoanalysis, has tried to convince us that religion is no more than just a collective, compulsive, obsessive neurosis of mankind, that God is no more than just the projection of a father image, and so forth. And what I think is that psychiatry, or for that matter psychology, should remain open without selecting certain phenomena that it allows to be existent. It should be open to all human phenomena. And one of the most important phenomena in human life is man's reaching out for a meaning to his existence. And even more, he's reaching out for an ultimate meaning to existence. And this believing in the existence of ultimate meaning is the root or the crown of religion.
What's your reaction to that video of Viktor Frankl?
Well, first of all, it's fascinating to see Viktor Frankl in the video. Very interesting indeed. But yes, he's making an absolutely valid point, and it's particularly resonant today when religion is so disparaged. I mean, he was basically saying that psychiatry disparages religion, but today in Britain especially, as I say, religion is associated with all bad things, and it's assumed that you can just dispose of it. It's assumed that the values that I would call civilized are independent of religion, that you can have the good society based on civilized values without religion, because these values are kind of programmed into us in that kind of part of our DNA. They are considered to be universal. And of course, they are not universal at all. They are particular to the West. They are particular to biblical values. They are particular to Judaism and Christianity. Because, I mean, we know this, we can show this quite easily, immediately, because no other culture has them. There is no other culture in the world that has these values. They may have borrowed some of them, but, you know, they are Western values. They come from the Bible. And this belief that you can, you know, do without religion has meant that people have failed to understand that religion is the moral scaffolding of a society. That it, you know, even if you aren't personally religious, the values of your society depend upon that scaffolding. Remove that scaffolding, remove the religion, and the society, like a building, just collapses. Now, the people who really understand that are, to come back to where we started in this conversation, are the Islamists. You know, for them, society has to be ruled by the word of God as they understand it. So they have a very particular view of religion, to put it mildly, but they do understand that a society that's done without religion collapses, and they perceived very accurately, in my view, decades ago, that that's what the West had done to itself in different places at different speeds. And they identified, I think, completely correctly, that the epicenter, to mix my metaphor, of this collapse was Britain, the most godless society, the one that had gone furthest and fastest away from a religious basis to their society. And so it was Britain where their efforts were concentrated, both in introducing terror and intimidation, and also trying to encroach upon and use the democratic processes to service their agenda of Islamization. And I think this is what, you know, what Viktor Frankl was saying, was that, you know, religion has to be taken on its face value and not dismissed. In Britain, people are very frightened of this. They think that as soon as you start talking about religion, then someone's going to start saying, you've got to become religious, you know, you've got to be converted. I'm certainly not saying that in my book. I'm saying in my book that I would hope that people of no religion, as well as people of religion, can agree that the values of the West are civilized values, and they have to be fought for. And that I would hope that all those people, including people who have no religious faith, understand that if you try to dismember those values, if you try to dislocate them from their religious basis and pretend they are universal, you eviscerate them, you destroy them. And I know a number of people who are atheists, agnostic, but who get this absolutely, and they are very much, very vocally part of the great attempt to, you know, to get the West back on track, because they get it. They understand that without religion, a society is nothing.
Let's talk about your own transformation that you talk about in your book, Guardian Angel. You began your career more on the left, working at The Guardian, and let's say you transitioned towards the right. How did it take place in your life?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say I've transitioned anywhere to the right. Anyway, I don't accept these terms. I don't accept the term right wing. I think it's just a generic insult. I know you haven't meant it as an insult at all, and many people use it perfectly innocently as meaning not the left. But it is used as an insult, and I think it's an incoherent term. I think the left is a coherent term because left-wingery is a specific way of looking at the world, whereas people on the right tend to be people who are just not left-wing. They may be what I would call old-fashioned liberals, as well as people who are conservative, as well as people who are more conservative. I would say that I was originally an old-fashioned liberal, actually. My mistake was to assume that it was the same as being left-wing. So I grew up, I was born in 1951, and I grew up in what was then a very typical British Jewish family. It belonged to an Orthodox synagogue. We belonged to an Orthodox synagogue. We were kosher. But my parents went to synagogue only 3 times a year on the high holy days. We were not observant on the Sabbath, on Shabbat. And that was pretty typical of the time. And I was given a very cursory Jewish education, again, very, very typical of the time. And the point was that my family was, I would say, left-wing, in the sense that it was unthinkable for them to vote for the Conservative Party. They were all Labour Party supporters because they were people who were very modest. They were intellectually modest. They were financially, economically modest, and they believed that the Labour Party, the left of politics, represented people like them. And that's how I grew up. And I also believed that people on the left were people who, because they were grounded in people who didn't have very much, they were people who naturally looked after each other. They had a sense of community. They had a sense of obligation, whereas people who weren't on the left didn't have that. They tended to be rich. They tended to be selfish. They tended to be people who just looked out for themselves. That's how I was brought up. And when I grew up, became a journalist, I was very, very happy to go to work for The Guardian, which is the kind of media Bible of left-wingery in Britain.
Kind of like, would you say, the New York Times in America?
It's more so than the New York Times.
More so.
Much more so. Much more so. More ideological than the New York Times. And as I say, I assumed that I was among like-minded souls because we all believed in the same things. We all stood for, I thought, we all stood for truth against lies, the persecuted against the persecutors, right against wrong, justice against injustice, compassion for the vulnerable. I still believe all those things that I believed all my life, I still believe. And I came to the conclusion, it wasn't a conclusion, it was a shocking realization in 1982, approximately 4 or 5 years after I joined The Guardian, that people I thought were marching alongside me under the same banner were actually on the other side. And what brought that about was, in fact, a Jewish issue. Now, I had never at that time been to Israel, never wanted to go to Israel. It wasn't my thing. I was in my professional life, I wrote about domestic social issues. I didn't write about foreign affairs. Israel was, a country that my family supported. We had a collection tin in our kitchen, as many Jewish families did. But as I say, we had never been there. And it was a country like for other Jews who were less privileged than us. We were living in the Golden Medina. I know that you Americans all thought you were living in the Golden Medina, but we also thought that in Britain.
We were until about a week ago.
Indeed. And so I wasn't paying a particular degree of attention to what was going on in Israel, but I was aware that in 1982, there was a very, very difficult war in Lebanon. I was aware that Israel had got itself into difficulties in that war. I was aware, however, that whatever difficulties and whatever mistakes it had made in that war, I was aware that it was a defensive war, as indeed all Israel's wars are defensive, because at that time, the Palestine Liberation Organization, a terrorist organization, had encamped itself in Lebanon, and from there was directing terror attacks to Israel. And so Israel felt it had no option but to go into Lebanon to clear it out. So I understood it was a defensive war, even though it might not have been prosecuted well. And I was horrified to find that among my colleagues on the left, Israel was presented as the aggressor. And it was the very first time I heard the Israelis described as Nazis. And to me, that was just crossing an absolute line, obviously, because it was bizarre and appalling. I mean, how could they possibly be Nazis? And I was a very different person then. I did not have the level of understanding that I have now. And I was also very concerned by the fact that there seemed to be a double standard at work. Around this period, during 1982, the then President Assad, who was the father of the Assad who was deposed not long ago, caused to be killed between 10 and 40,000 of his political opponents over a period of about 2 weeks.
I think his son beat him on those statistics.
Well, indeed.
40 years later, yeah.
Well, indeed. But nevertheless, it was, a thing. 10 to 40,000 people just mown down in 2 weeks. And at The Guardian, it was met with a shrug. It was a down page, foreign pages news story. That was all. No comment, nothing.
Not front page news.
But whenever Israel in Lebanon killed 3, 4, 5 Palestinian Arabs, it was a front page splash, and there was, a furious editorial, and there were outraged op-eds. And so I said to my colleagues, I was then an editorial writer, and I said to my colleagues one day, why do we seem to have a double standard? And they all looked at me as if I'd crossed a line, which indeed I had. From that point, I was a marked person. And they said, well, of course we have a double standard. People in Syria, the developing world, aren't brought up to have the same values as we do. And we assume that you are like us. And I had become immediately you. You're
no longer we, now you're you. No longer
we. I became you. We assume that you are like us. I mean, really? I mean, what? What are they talking about here? You are like us? What, the Jews? We assume that you Jews are like us? I mean, what was this? And they went on, so like us, we all believe in things like, the sanctity of human life, human rights, all those things. But the developing world, the Syrians in the developing world, don't believe those things. They're not brought up to those things. So we can't judge them by our standards. That would be racism. And I said, what are you talking about? If you are saying that people brought up in the developing world aren't entitled to the same rights to life and liberty as we are, to me, that's racism. And from that moment, something very profound changed in me, because I realized that they were, first of all, anti-Semites. What is this? You tell us. And they also said, you say that you are more moral than us. And my goodness me. I mean, these were, liberal anti-racists to the core. And this is what they come up with because I have dared to question the double standard, which they then go on to support and to endorse on the basis that people in the developing world aren't as human as they are. And I realized that they stood for everything that I was against. But it took me a very long time to separate myself from them. It's a bit like waking up one day finding your family has abused you, is abusing you, and you can't believe it because they're your family. And if I now believe they are abusing me, it means that for the last several decades, I've been living in a fantasy world, a fool's paradise, a make-believe world. I mean, what sort of idiot am I? It's all that. It's very hard to take that on board. And it's very hard to leave people who are your family. But they left me. From that moment, I was a marked person. I then, because I was kind of freed from believing that what they stood for was a kind of moral touchstone, I then started to look at issues in a much more objective fashion, which is when I started to write about the onslaught on education and family and nation, all those things. And consequently, I was kind of sent into internal exile. I became an unperson. I was cancelled, basically. But it took me a long time to free myself, nevertheless, from it all, but eventually I did. So I wouldn't say that I've moved to the right. I wince when I hear that. I know you didn't mean it in that way. But to me, I moved from a view of the world which was a kind of fantasy, in which it was dishonest. It was pretending the world isn't as it is. And it was inventing stuff that was untrue and being horrible about people who did stand for reality. And so it was a progression from fantasy to reality, actually, is how I would prefer to think about it.
And what's your advice now for American Jewry? Many of those who have been supporters of the Democratic Party for perhaps 75 years right now.
Well, I was in America fairly recently doing some speaking engagements about my book. And so I met a number of American Jews. And almost by definition, the kind of people who would come to my talks are people who are already prepared to listen, at least to what I have to say. So I wasn't, well, by definition, I wasn't reaching the kind of people that you're alluding to, who are implacably wedded to the ideologies of the left. I was meeting people who either were not on the left and who were absolutely horrified by everything that was going on, or a number of people, and I was told it was a significant number, who until October 7, 2023 had been on the left and then had a terrible shock to their system because the things that they had supported and the people they'd supported turned out to be the very thing that they hated and feared and despised.
Well, the people that supported them abandoned them at that moment.
That's also true. That's also true. And I found people in a state of complete those people in a state of complete discombobulation, and I sympathize because it wasn't so different from what I'd gone through all those years ago, although over a longer time scale. Now, as I understand it, some 70% of American Jews vote for the Democratic Party and would not dream of voting for the Republican Party. And those people, I'm afraid, have drunk the Kool-Aid because not only have they subscribed to ideologies which I think are fundamentally anti-West and anti-Jew, anti-Judaism, all of them. They've told themselves that they're actually Jewish values. They've kind of tried to square the circle by using this term tikkun olam, which in my view, they have abused dreadfully, and pretending that values which are all about the individual and realizing individual demands, meeting individual demands, and accepting or believing that reality is whatever you make it to be, and that anybody who doesn't agree with you has to be suppressed, and that every kind of lifestyle choice is perfectly valid, and you cannot say that any one creed or value system is better than any other. This is all based on ideologies which replace truth by power, and which are inimical to Judaism, and which are destroying Judaism among those people. They may hang on to the outward show in a kind of sentimental and superficial way, in terms of food, dress, speech, whatever. But it's entirely superficial. Their children, their grandchildren will no longer be Jewish, increasingly. And that's a great tragedy. Can those people be brought back? I doubt it, but it's possible, and I think one should try. The problem, I think, with the Jewish community in America, as indeed in Britain, is that the people who do get it are silent. They're not prepared to speak up and speak out. There is this terrible feeling that the single worst thing that Jews can do to themselves is to be disunited. That is the thing that has destroyed us in the past. Well, actually, I would disagree. Certainly, disunity is a terrible thing. Without doubt, it weakens a community dreadfully. Without doubt, it is to be avoided wherever possible. Sure, you patch up, you make do, you make alliances, you have to get on. True. But if you take that view with people who are aggressively standing for, values which are a dagger to the heart of Judaism and to the Jewish people, then you are embracing your own cultural suicide. You can't do that. There is something worse than disunity. and that is going along with ideologies which will destroy the Jewish people and destroy Judaism. You can't do that. So I think that the Jewish people has to start talking about that properly. It has to start analyzing how it's gone down this rabbit hole. But also people who get it often don't get it. People who consider themselves to be very Zionistic, very pro-Israel. They may even have, houses in Herzliya they go to several times a year, that kind of thing. They have family in Israel and so on and so forth. But they've drunk the Kool-Aid, especially in Britain. I'm told by a number of these people, well, of course I support Israel. Of course I understand. And of course Iran is terrible. And of course we have to defeat the Hamas. But why do the IDF have to kill so many babies? And they've absolutely imbibed the propaganda. And also, they're not prepared to say that the Jews alone are entitled to all the land. Legally, only the Jews are entitled to all the land, what is now Israel, the so-called West Bank, the disputed territories of Judea and Samaria, and Gaza. Now, I'm not for one moment saying that Israel should retain all those lands. Of course not. But the sting of what we're all up against in this terrible animus against Israel is that Israel is a kind of usurper. It's a colonizer. It's not entitled to be there. And even if people think it's entitled to be inside what is the state of Israel, it's not entitled to be in the West Bank. And it wasn't entitled to be in Gaza. We'll leave Gaza to one side. The Israelis came out of Gaza in 2005. But the disputed territories of the West Bank, so many Jews don't want to understand that it's not extremism to say that only the Jews are entitled to that land. It is what is legally the case, historically the case. Now, unfortunately, because so many diaspora Jews are ignorant of these and many, many similar other facts about Jewish history in the Middle East, in the land of Israel. And they are timid, understandably, very frightened. They want to sort of placate the surrounding society. They don't stand up and say these things. So it's going by default. And the final problem that the Jewish community has in America and in Britain is that even among kids who have Jewish education, it seems to me, and I'm speaking, I'm sure, ill-advisedly because, I'm not American, but so many American kids who've been through Jewish schools really don't know enough about what makes Judaism great. They're taught so many things which are to do with procedure, the procedure of Judaism, how to conduct yourself as an observant Jew. And that's great, that's fine. But they're not taught much Jewish history. They're not taught much Jewish ethics. They're not taught Jewish values. They're certainly not taught about the unique and irreplaceable contribution that their Jewish values have made to the American and British society, the West that they live in. And consequently, they're ignorant. And when they are attacked, they don't have the wherewithal, they don't have the language to deal with this because they don't know enough about Judaism itself. This is a tremendous failing. This is all a tremendous failing by Jewish leadership in America and in Britain. It has done such a terrible job in educating its own community, let alone the wider world.
And that's why your book, The Builder's Stone, is so incredibly important, because it gives people the understanding of what the issues really are: returning to values, strengthening Judeo-Christian civilization, understanding the left, how it operates, and being more pro-Israel from a proud perspective. And as you mentioned, a legalistic perspective as well. So if people want to follow your work, how do they get your books, and how do they follow you online as well?
Well, some of my books are still in print, but the current book, the new book, which was published in January, The Builder's Stone, is only available through Amazon. You go to Amazon, you buy the book, and then they print it. That's how this works. It's called print on demand. It's published by an American publisher called Wicked Sun, based in New York. But you get it through Amazon. You can find Londonistan is still in print. You might find it in a bookshop, but you can certainly get that on Amazon. And also a previous book I wrote, The World Turned Upside Down, The Global Battle Over God, Truth and Power, which kind of predates The Builder's Stone in terms of its theme. That was published, I think, in 2010. That's also available on Amazon. For my work, my journalistic work, I have a website and I write a fairly regular blog. I put all my work on my website. The website you can access by going to melaniephillips.substack.com, and you can find pretty well everything I'm writing there.
Melanie Phillips, thank you so much for joining us today on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you.